This is Tyne Cot British Cemetery here just outside of the city of Ypres in Belgium. This is the largest British cemetery in the world. There are just about 12,000 headstones here and over 8,000 of them are unknown. A really horrifying statistic that really shows you the ferocity of the fighting that took place in these fields around here during the First World War. If you look very, very closely behind me, right here, about 5.5 miles away is the city of Ypres itself. You can see the spires of the Cloth Hall and St. Martin's Cathedral. Between this ground and the city of Ypres itself saw some of the worst fighting to take place pretty much in the history of humanity. Between 1914 and 1918, 3 massive battles took place here. The first, second, and third Battle of Ypres, third also known as the Battle of Passchendaele, took place in these fields around me. And hundreds of thousands of men died. Germans trying to take the city of Ypres, and the Allies, the British Commonwealth, the Belgians, and the French trying to hold the Germans back. Inside the perimeter of Tyne Cot Cemetery, there are 3 German bunkers. One right here, another one over there. These first 2 bunkers were captured by the 40th Australian Infantry Battalion on October the 4th, 1917, during the Passchendaele Offensive. And the third bunker is over there, where the Cross of Sacrifice now rests on top of. And that bunker was not captured until October the 9th by the 197th British Infantry Brigade. So between these bunkers and that bunker is practically a battlefield, which now lies the graves of thousands and thousands of British Commonwealth soldiers. This is the wall of the missing with no known graves here at Tyne Cot Cemetery. The walls on either side of me record the names of almost 34,000 men whose graves are not known between August 1917 and the end of the war in November 1918. From the beginning of the fighting, from around October 1914, up until that cutoff date of August 1917, those names are recorded in Ypres itself at the Menin Gate, while the rest are recorded here. So between this wall, the missing, and the missing at Menin Gate accounts for almost 89,000 men of the British Commonwealth armies whose graves are unknown around the city of Ypres. This is Langemark German Cemetery here just outside of Ypres in Belgium. This is one of the largest German cemeteries in the world. There are about 44,000 men buried here, and about 24,000 of those men are in this mass grave. So on either side of this mass grave that holds the remains of 24,000 Germans are their names, at least the ones that they know are in there. Now, in terms of the amount of land that this cemetery takes up, it's not super big. It's a fairly small cemetery, but there are 44,000 men buried here. If you look down at each of these headstones, this one has 8 men, another 8 men, 8 men, another 8. And so if you think about it, each one of these headstones accounts for several German soldiers. Really does take your breath away. My God. When I said each of these graves contains several men, it's more than several in a lot of these cases. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. I mean, oh my God. So effectively, this entire place is one giant mass grave. Oh my God. Got some bunkers inside of this cemetery. There's one there, and another right there. You know, something I've noticed on this trip is that almost everywhere I go, there are school trips going on with tour guides, with young kids. This place and the people that live here and around here really take the history of this area very seriously. They have a great deal of respect for it. It's quite amazing. On April 22nd, 1915, the German front line actually ran through this area pretty much right through the middle of this cemetery. And it was in these fields on either side of the cemetery where the Germans launched the first use of lethal poison gas. Quite an incredible place to be. Very heavy. When the Germans launched that first deadly gas attack on April 22nd, 1915, what they were using was chlorine gas, and it was terrible stuff. If you ingested it, it destroyed soft tissue, and so your lungs and your insides would fill with blood until you basically drowned from the inside out. So approximately in this area here, there would have been a cloud of greenish mist that just swept over this area down that way. The Allied front line was in that direction, and it was at the time being held by French colonial troops, and they had obviously no idea what was coming their way. And as that green mist started to come towards them, their comrades were falling over, coughing, clenching their throats, desperately trying to get some air. Men were dying all around them, and so those soldiers retreated from the front line, leaving a 6-kilometer gap in the Allied front line that the Germans were free to exploit. So, when the Germans launched that gas attack on that night, April 22nd, 1915, that was the opening phase of the Second Battle of Ypres. Now, when the Allies in that section of the front line retreated, there was that gap that I already mentioned, and that had to be plugged. And that job was given to the Canadians. Right now I'm in the village of Saint-Julien, just outside of the city of Ypres in Belgium, and this behind me is the Brooding Soldier. The Brooding Soldier is a monument that is dedicated to the Canadians for their actions during the Second Battle of Ypres that began when the Germans launched the first deadly use of poison gas in warfare on, I believe, April 22nd, 1915. When the Germans launched that first poison gas attack, there was a huge gap made in the Allied front line as soldiers were retreating. And so to plug the gap, they sent the Canadians. And the Canadians, with no gas masks, no protective gear to protect them against the poison gas, went in and stopped the German advance towards Ypres, which is in that direction, at the cost of 2,000 lives. This plaque on the Brooding Soldier reads, "This column marks the battlefield where 18,000 Canadians on the British left withstood the first German gas attacks, the 22nd to 24th of April 1915. 2,000 fell and lie buried nearby." Wow. I'm at Hooge Crater. I should be using it plurally as in craters. What you see in front of me, what looks like a lake, is actually 4 overlapping craters that were detonated during the First World War. These are the result of underground mining operations that took place underneath enemy fortifications. So at one point, the trenches, the front line would have ran just over this area right here. And these mines were detonated by both the British and the Germans. The first one here detonated by the Germans in 1915, then the British in 1916, and then 1917, and so on. So now what you have are overlapping craters which have since been filled with water, now resemble a lake, but undoubtedly underneath this lake remains the bodies of many, many men. This gives a really good perspective on the level of destruction that this area took during the war. If you look here, this is the Menin Road. This is what we just drove up on. It's in that direction. Then this is a year later. You could see the landscape has continued to be shelled. And 1918, where the landscape is pretty much completely unrecognizable. Pretty much the entire area around here, around the Ypres salient, looked like this, a complete wasteland. So the area of land that Hooge rests on is known as the Bellewaerde Ridge. It's a slight rise in the ground that gives a good vantage point towards Ypres itself, which is in that direction. Over there is the Menin Road. And during the first Battle of Ypres that started in October 1914 and ended in November, the front line that the Germans were halted at was just beyond that way, what is known as Hooge Chateau. It's now no longer there. It was never rebuilt. It's the site of an amusement park. But if you look over here, this bed and breakfast stands on the site of the stables of that chateau. And it was in 1915 that the Germans were able to push during the Second Battle of Ypres just up until here, where they're able to capture the stables, pretty much overlooking what were at the time the British front lines, which ran just over this area. And then you get the first mine detonation in 1915 when the Germans were trying to push the British back from this area back towards the Menin Road, which is over there, to get that vital vantage point on top of the Bellewaerde Ridge that looks towards Ypres. So I'm on top of the Bellewaerde Ridge. This is the Menin Road, and you can see why this area was so important, how this is a bit of high ground and how it dips down to the flat area around Ypres. And you can see the spires of the Cloth Hall just there in the distance. It really amazes me how incredibly close this fighting happened to the city itself. So amazing. So this bunker right here is actually a British bunker. It was constructed in the winter of 1915 into 1916. And then during that constant sway back and forth of fighting that took place here, after the Germans detonated another mine here in 1916, they occupied this bunker and pushed the British back that way towards the Menin Road once again. And now this front door became visible to the British for them to pour fire into it after the Germans had occupied it. And so the Germans constructed this L-shaped lip to protect this front door from incoming fire. And you can actually go inside this bunker. They're nice enough to put a little light in here so that you can see for yourself. Back there is a original lantern from the First World War. I don't like it down there. It's a little spooky. After the Germans were able to capture this British bunker in 1916 and push the British yet again back that way towards the Menin Road, in July 1917 is when the Battle of Third Ypres, or the Passchendaele Offensive, began, and the British were again able to occupy these craters and take back this bunker. And so much of the damage that you see here is from that fighting in July 1917. One thing I wanted to point out is this artillery gun they got here, I think is totally fake. It just looks like a big piece of industrial pipe with some random metal plating and some wheels to make it look like an artillery piece, but that's not the point. This area really saw some of the most bitter fighting in the entire salient. It's really hard to imagine that so many men fell in such a small piece of land. It's really quite remarkable. So Hooge is not only famous for these overlapping craters here, this is also the site of the very first use of flamethrowers in warfare. On July 30th, 1915, the Germans deployed Flammenwerfer, which is German for liquid fire. They came down from this direction, sweeping down here towards the British, which were in that direction in the middle of the night. And in the chaos and darkness, the British scattered and retreated back that way over the Menin Road. These are original frontline trenches. These were originally constructed by the Germans in 1915 after the detonation of the first mine here at Hooge Crater. So like I said before, the British front line would have ran just over the crater that you see now. When the Germans detonated that first mine, they were able to occupy that front line. The British were pushed back towards the Menin Road, and the Germans entrenched here and created these frontline trenches. Then on July 19th, 1915, the British launched a counterattack from the Menin Road up this way and captured these trenches. And then July 30th, 11 days later, is the first flamethrower attack that happened that I mentioned before, when the Germans swept down from the crater in this way and using their Flammenwerfer scattered the British from these frontline trenches and pushed them back towards the Menin Road. Again, emphasizing that back and forth sway that this area had over the entirety of the war. A real testament to the fierce fighting that happened here are the large amount of shells, piles and piles of them all over the place, left over from the First World War. It's pretty crazy to be able to pick one of these things up and realize that each one of these shells most likely accounted for the death of a man or a couple of men. It's hard to imagine. This is really cool. This is a British Lee Enfield rifle. It doesn't really look like it, but all the wood has obviously rotted away, and what you're left with is the got the barrel, the bolt itself, the receiver, and someone nailed it to a tree so that it's visible. That's super sick. This behind me is the village of Passchendaele. During the Third Ypres Offensive that began in July 1917, this piece of high ground that I'm standing on right now, known as the Passchendaele Ridge, was the main objective of the British and Commonwealth armies. Now, during the offensive, this village was actually obliterated off the face of the earth. There was nothing standing. Everything you see here has been completely rebuilt. Now, on October 30th, 1917, the Canadian Corps began its advance towards this village from this valley behind me here. Now, starting their advance from this valley up this way, it took them 10 days to get to this spot that I'm standing right now. And in the process, they took 16,000 casualties. It's known as the bloodiest campaign that the Canadians have ever been a part of. And in their honor, they have erected this monument on top of the Passchendaele Ridge that reads, "The Canadian Corps in October-November 1917 advanced across this valley, then a treacherous morass, captured and held the Passchendaele Ridge." Finally, on November 10th, the Canadians were able to make their way to this spot and launch their final assault on the village of Passchendaele itself. The Germans withdrew from the village beyond and to better defensive positions, and the Canadians were finally able to capture Passchendaele. If you ever come here to Ypres, Belgium, you will discover that there are tons of cemeteries scattered all over the place from the First World War. In fact, I believe there are over 100 British and Commonwealth cemeteries in and around the city of Ypres itself. There are a couple different types of cemeteries. The first one and most common one you'll see are collective cemeteries. They tend to be the larger ones. Those are cemeteries made after the fighting, when the fields around the area were cleaned up and the bodies were collected in those cemeteries. They tend to look a bit more neat, and again, they tend to be a bit larger. And then there are battlefield cemeteries. Like this one here, this is Polygon Wood Cemetery. So when I say battlefield cemeteries, what I mean is these men around me were buried during the fighting in the heat of battle out of necessity. The men in their units, their comrades, had to get these bodies moved out of the way for sanitation reasons, or simply just to get them out of the way to prepare for the next attack. Whatever the case may be, these men were buried almost where they fell. And here is where they remain to this day. So while you're looking at battlefield cemeteries, you'll notice that there will be clusters of men that died on the same day. This is a group of New Zealand soldiers that died on the 13th of December, 1917. And of course, due to the chaos of battle, some of them remain unidentified. But here they lie in peace. A sad truth about cemeteries like these is that these cemeteries during the fighting were located near the front line. And so if somebody was buried here, or a group of men were buried here, and the fighting continued around the area, sometimes during artillery bombardments or just during the heat of battle, graves would be lost. Either the headstones would be missing due to explosions by artillery, or the bodies themselves would be lost, blown out of the ground by explosions. And then you get this. So this is Rifleman Putt, and it says known to be buried in this cemetery. However, they cannot be for sure what spot exactly his body rests at. So like I said, the large collective cemeteries are fairly easy to identify. The graves are neatly laid out, almost as if they're standing to attention in death. But these battlefield cemeteries are obviously much more haphazardly placed. There are random graves spaced out all over the place. Really shows you the chaotic nature of the fighting in which these men died and had to be buried. Behind me here is the monument to the 5th Australian Infantry Division. The 5th Australian Infantry Division, with support on their left flank from the 4th Australian Infantry Division and on their right from the 33rd British Infantry Division, attacked these woods. This is Polygon Wood, beginning on September 26, 1917, during the 3rd Battle of Ypres. Actually, 6 months prior to that, the 5th Australian Division was almost pretty much wiped out at Fromelles in France during the Battle of the Somme. So they took 6 months to recover and then were sent here to Ypres just in time for the 3rd Great Battle. They were tasked with taking this wood, and it took about 2 days to do so. In the process, they took almost 5,000 casualties. And just below me here is a collective cemetery known as Butte's New British Cemetery, here in the middle of Polygon Wood. Here in Butte's New British Cemetery in Polygon Wood, there are just about 2,000 burials here, and about 1,600 of them are unknown. A very common thing that you will find in these cemeteries around Ypres, that again, like I'm trying to emphasize, really goes to show the absolutely horrific nature of fighting that took place in this area around me. I'm currently walking through Polygon Wood itself, and I'm not gonna lie to you, this place is spooky, knowing what happened here. But it's important to remember when talking about Polygon Wood, and really the entire area of Ypres around me, none of this was here. Polygon Wood was completely wiped off the face of the earth, and what was left was a moonscape, crater-filled, wasteland that these soldiers had to fight through. This entire forest that you see around me is just over 100 years old, as it was finally able to regrow after the fighting. But like I said, none of this was here. This was just a flat wasteland of a battlefield. This German bunker right here in Polygon Wood is named Scott Post, named after the commander of the 56th Australian Battalion, that captured this bunker during the Battle of Polygon Wood on September 26th, 1917. You can take a look inside, and it is musty. Woo! This is Sanctuary Wood, not too far from the city of Ypres. In that direction right there is Hill 62. Just like every piece of land around the city of Ypres, this saw intense fighting throughout the entirety of the First World War. During the early stages of the fighting around here in 1914 and 1915, this was regarded as a fairly quiet sector of the Ypres salient, thus the name Sanctuary Wood. But it didn't last. In 1916, particularly on June 2nd to June 6th, 1916, this area saw some ferocious German attacks. And then beginning on the 13th of June, the British and the Canadians launched a counterattack that was staged pretty much from these trenches here and on either side of them and up that direction towards Hill 62. They've done a remarkable job keeping these trenches pretty well preserved. You can still see the duck boards on the bottom here. Notice how these trenches sort of zigzag, and that was definitely intentional. It's much more dangerous to have a straight line of trenches for a few reasons. If a shell was to burst inside of a long trench, then the blast would travel along the length of the trench and kill more men than if it was in a zigzag formation. And also, if this trench was being attacked, that you simply couldn't just aim your gun down the whole length of the trench and fire down on it. So doing these zigzag formations made the trench a much better area of protection and made them much more defensible. But what I'm really curious about in here is where the hell this leads to. That is creepy. It might be a little bit hard to see, but just beyond this tree line, if I zoom in here, is Hill 62. The Germans would have had a really commanding view of this whole area from up top there. Right here behind me are the British front lines. So pretty much where I'm standing would be no man's land. Just a shell cratered filled, barbed wire filled, dead body filled wasteland. Really just a horror show, really. And it can be hard looking around an area like this today with all these trees and vegetation that has grown up since, but I cannot overstate this enough, just how horrible of a landscape this was during the war. This land is so incredibly battle-scarred. It can be hard to imagine the rest of this area around the city of Ypres looking like this as well, but it did. The fact that there is a wood here in the first place means that this area was not touched and was not cultivated. And that's really evident when you look directly behind me and you see these beautiful rolling farm fields on either side of Sanctuary Wood. It really goes to show that the Belgian people had to work incredibly hard to recover their land. Really, every square inch of land around this area would have looked like this, would have looked like Sanctuary Wood does today, if it was not for the tenacity of the Belgian people in recovering their land and getting back to their livelihoods after the war. But they understood that for future generations, it's incredibly important to keep some of those reminders to, remind future generations that these things happen, that wars must be avoided, that we must maintain peace at all costs. So small patches of land like here at Sanctuary Wood were pretty much left untouched through the generations to allow people to sort of get in that headspace to try and for at least a minute try to understand what it must have been like during the First World War here. The people that take care of this area at Sanctuary Wood have pulled out just an unbelievable amount of shit from the ground here that has just been left from the war.
God, it's insane.
This is Poelcapelle British Cemetery here outside Ypres. I think out of all of the cemeteries here in Ypres, this one has the highest percentage of unknown men. There's a total of 7,480 men buried here, and just about over 6,200 of them, 6,200 of them, are unknown. This is pretty remarkable. This stone near the front wall of Poelcapelle Cemetery reads, "To the memory of these 27 soldiers of the British Empire who fell in 1915 and 1917 and were buried at the time in," and then it lists a number of what I'm assuming to be battlefield cemeteries that were established during the war, but whose graves were later destroyed in battle. Their glory shall not be blotted out. So these men are not buried here, but their headstones rest here in their memory. Really makes you think. So the reason for the ridiculously high percentage of unknown men buried in this cemetery is due to the fact that this cemetery wasn't established until 1919, a year after the war had ended. So this is a great example of a collective cemetery. These men, these bodies were collected from the fields around here and were placed here, and due to the circumstances of decomposition and the bad state the bodies were in at that time, most of them were not identifiable. I'm sitting at the grave of John Condon. John Condon belonged to the Royal Irish Regiment, and he was killed during the Second Battle of Ypres on 24th of May 1915 at Mousetrap Farm. Mousetrap Farm is just a couple miles from here. During the first use of artillery gas shells, so the first time that gas was ever deployed using artillery by the Germans. But that's not what makes his grave special. It's not what makes his story special, I should say. If you haven't noticed already, it shows his age of death at 14 years old. This would make John Condon the youngest soldier to be killed in the entire First World War. Now, there is some controversy behind that due to a lack of information on his birth certificate. Some people believe his body may have been misidentified, but none of that has necessarily been confirmed. And so, if this headstone is to be believed, he was 14 years old when he was killed during the Second Battle of Ypres. And his situation would not necessarily be unique. There was an investigation carried out by the British government after the war that estimated there was somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 boys under the age of 18 that served in the British Army or in the Commonwealth armies during the First World War. But like I said, if his headstone is to be believed, John Condon would be the youngest man killed in the First World War. Pretty remarkable to be sitting here. Behind me here is Hill 60. Like I say about every site I'm visiting here in the Ypres salient, this saw terrible fighting during the First World War. This is actually an artificial hill. In the 1850s, there was a railway in this area being made. When they excavated the earth, when they were cutting out the area for the railway, they put the earth there. It rises 60 meters above sea level, thus Hill 60. This area was captured by the Germans after the First Battle of Ypres in December 1914. And if you look below me here, this marker represents the British front line in January 1915, just after this area was captured by the Germans. And if you follow me this way, this represents the German front line in December 1914. How close is that? Maybe 20 feet? 30 feet, they could practically speak to each other. It's really hard to imagine how men could fight in those conditions. So after the Germans were able to capture this hill in December 1914, they held onto it until April 1915, when on April 17th, 1915, British tunnelers were able to detonate a number of mines in this area that dislodged the Germans from their frontline positions, allowing the 5th British Division to rush the hill and occupy it. However, 3 weeks later, in the opening phases of the Second Battle of Ypres, the Germans launched a major gas attack in this area, and they were able to again capture it. I'm near Hill 60, just outside of Ypres. Hill 60 is behind this monument in that direction, and just beyond that is the Caterpillar crater. This is the monument to the first Australian tunneling company. This marks the spot where they began tunneling towards the German front lines here. But the unique thing about this memorial is that when this area was reoccupied by the Germans in 1940 during the Second World War, they used this monument as target practice. This bunker here was constructed by the Germans when they were able to recapture the hill during the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915, and they held on to the high ground here until June 1917, quite a while. It was then that the British were able to detonate more mines in this area. I believe that's when the Caterpillar mine behind us was detonated, and they were able to occupy this high ground and occupy this bunker too. And actually, these slits that you see that were cut out of this bunker were not by the Germans. They were cut out by the British to put machine guns into fire in that direction, because that's the direction that the Germans retreated off of the hill when the British were able to capture it in June 1917. Another interesting thing about this bunker is that a lot of the damage that you see here, some of it is the First World War, but also some of it is from the Second World War. This area was fought over by the British Expeditionary Force, while the rest of the British Expeditionary Force and the rest of the French army was trying to be evacuated at Dunkirk. There was a delay in action here at Ypres, and Hill 60 featured prominently in that battle. After the war, Hill 60 and the land around it was bought by a British family, and they decided to leave this area untouched as it stayed after the war. And so when you're walking around here, you'll see the remains of bunkers. There's shell holes everywhere. The ground has very definitely taken a massive pounding during the war, and it's very cool that that British family decided to do that with this place, because there is undoubtedly the bodies of many men still beneath our feet here today, and now it has been left to nature. This monument here on top of Hill 62 is really unique, and you'll know why when I read it to you. On this spot was erected in 1923 a memorial to all ranks of Queen Victoria's Rifles who gave their lives for their country in the First World War, 1914 and 1918. The memorial having been destroyed in 1940 by the Germans, this plaque has been placed by the regiment on some of the original stones of the memorial to perpetuate their memory, and in the grateful remembrance of those who gave their lives in the Second World War, 1939 to 1945. This behind me is the site of the Christmas Truce Memorial of 1914. On Christmas Day and Christmas Eve of 1914, Germans on this side, British on this side, met each other in no man's land to exchange gifts, show each other letters and pictures from loved ones, even cut each other's hair and play some football. You know, I've been traveling around the Ypres salient for a couple days now and learning about all the death and destruction that happened here. I mean, the Ypres salient in the history of mankind, in the history of warfare, was probably one of the most dangerous and horrible places you could ever be, ever. But in the midst of all that death and chaos, these men took a moment to understand that no matter what side you're on, British, German, French, Belgian, that nobody wanted to be here. Nobody wanted to be sitting in these trenches in these Belgian fields, killing each other. So for a moment, they took some time to meet each other, to talk, to understand each other and to really show that human compassion that every one of us has, even in the darkest of times. It's unfortunate that a circumstance like this happened to allow these men to meet each other in that way. I mean, if you look beyond this, there is a battlefield cemetery back there that constantly reminds you as you're looking at this monument that this was still a war, that these men were still here to kill each other. But on their own initiative, they took the time to celebrate Christmas together. And I think that it was probably one of the most beautiful events to take place really in history. Now, this isn't the only spot where the Christmas truce happened. It happened all along the Western Front. But to stand here today knowing that this is where it happened really touches my heart and really gives me hope for mankind, for our future and for future generations. We must remember events such as these. In the grand scheme of the First World War, events like these are incredibly important.